July 18, 1965, 3:42 a.m. The flames were still climbing when Bumpy Johnson's Cadillac pulled up to 125th Street. 3 buildings burning, black smoke pouring into the Harlem sky. And on the sidewalk, written in white paint that glowed orange in the firelight, 2 words that made Bumpy's jaw tighten. Go home. 47 black-owned businesses had been torched that night. Restaurants, barbershops, a pharmacy, a funeral home. Places that had served this community for decades. Places where children got their first haircuts, where families celebrated graduations, where old men played chess on Sunday afternoons, all of it burning. The fire department was there, but they were moving slow, too slow. Bumpy watched a white fireman laugh at something his partner said while Mrs. Patterson's dress shop collapsed into ash. A crowd had gathered, hundreds of people, some crying, some screaming. Some ready to tear this city apart with their bare hands. That's when Bumpy stepped out of his car. The crowd parted, they always did. And Bumpy Johnson, 60 years old, gray at the temples, walked through the smoke until he stood in front of those painted words, Go home. He stared at them for a long moment. Then he turned to face his people and said 8 words that would echo through Harlem for generations. They want a war. We'll give them ruin. What nobody knew, what the men who lit those fires would discover too late, is that Bumpy Johnson had been preparing for this moment for 6 months. And what he did over the next 72 hours didn't just rebuild Harlem. It destroyed the men who thought they could burn it down. To understand what happened in the summer of 1965, you need to understand what Harlem had become and why powerful men downtown wanted to watch it burn. By 1965, Harlem was changing. The civil rights movement had reached New York. Black voices were getting louder. Black businesses were getting stronger. And for the first time in decades, black money was staying in black hands. This terrified certain people. For generations, white-owned businesses had extracted wealth from Harlem like miners pulling gold from a mountain. They owned the grocery stores that overcharged for rotten produce. They owned the tenements that charged double rent for half the space. They owned the insurance companies that denied every claim. They took and took and took, and they called it commerce. But by 1965, things were different. A new generation of black entrepreneurs had emerged. They opened their own stores, their own restaurants, their own banks. Money that used to flow downtown was circulating within the community, building wealth, building power, building something that couldn't be controlled. At the center of this economic revolution was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy had always understood that real power wasn't about guns or territory. It was about money. Who had it? Who controlled it? Who decided where it flowed? And for 20 years, he'd been quietly building an infrastructure that funneled resources back into his community. He'd helped finance 37 black-owned businesses along 125th Street. He'd established a loan program for young entrepreneurs who couldn't get credit from white banks. He'd created a network of suppliers, distributors, and investors that kept Harlem's economy running independent of downtown interests. Every dollar that stays in Harlem, Bumpy once said, is a brick in the wall they can't tear down. By the summer of '65, that wall was getting tall enough to cast a shadow, and some very powerful men decided it was time to tear it down. Man behind the arson was named Vincent Calabrese, a real estate developer with connections to City Hall and the Italian mob. Calabrese had been buying up property in Harlem for years, waiting for the day when the neighborhood would turn, when the blacks would leave and white money would flood back in. But that day wasn't coming. Harlem wasn't dying, it was thriving. And every successful black business was another reason for residents to stay, to invest, to build. Calabrese needed those businesses gone. He needed Harlem afraid. He needed a crisis that would drive property values down and send families running. So he created one. The planning started in March of 1965. Calabrese met with a group of like-minded men at a private club in Midtown, real estate developers, insurance executives, and 2 city councilmen who represented districts they'd never actually visited. The problem with Harlem, Calabrese said, swirling a glass of scotch, is that these people are getting comfortable. They think they belong there. They think it's theirs. So what do you propose? Asked one of the councilmen. We remind them it isn't. We remind them that everything they've built can disappear overnight. Calabrese smiled. Fire has a way of clarifying things. The plan was simple. Hire local criminals, white men from Hell's Kitchen who'd burn anything for the right price. Hit multiple targets in a single night. Make it look like a race riot. Let the newspapers do the rest. Once those businesses are gone, the residents will follow, Calabrese explained. Property values collapse. We buy everything at pennies on the dollar. In 5 years, Harlem is ours. They set the date for July 18th, a Sunday night when the streets would be quiet. They identified 47 targets, the most successful black-owned businesses on 125th Street and the surrounding blocks. What Calabrese didn't know was that one of the men in that room worked for Bumpy Johnson. His name was Gerald Morrison. On paper, he was an insurance executive who handled policies for several Harlem businesses. In reality, he was one of Bumpy's oldest friends, a man who'd been feeding him information about downtown interests for 15 years. 2 days after that meeting, Morrison was sitting in Bumpy's office above Small's Paradise. "They're going to burn it down," Morrison said, sliding a list of addresses across the desk. "All of it. July 18th. Bumpy studied the list. His face showed nothing. "Why are you telling me this?" Bumpy asked. "You could warn the police, the fire department, the newspapers." Morrison shook his head. "The police are in Calabrese's pocket. Half the fire department is on his payroll. And the newspapers will print whatever story he feeds them." He paused. "You're the only one who can stop this." Bumpy was quiet for a long moment. Then he folded the list and slipped it into his jacket. "I'm not going to stop it." Morrison's eyes went wide. "What? If I warn the business owners, Calabrese will know he has a leak. He'll wait 6 months and try again, or he'll find another way, something I can't see coming." Bumpy stood and walked to the window. "No, let him light his fires. Let him think he's won. And then—" Bumpy turned back, and there was something in his eyes that Morrison had never seen before. Not anger, not grief, something colder. "And then I'll show him what it means to make war on Harlem." For the next 4 months, Bumpy prepared. He didn't warn the business owners. He didn't alert the authorities. Instead, he did something that seemed almost cruel. He made sure every single one of those 47 businesses had comprehensive insurance policies. Policies that would pay out in full, no matter what happened. He created emergency funds, hidden in accounts that couldn't be traced. He arranged temporary locations where displaced businesses could operate while their buildings were rebuilt. He stockpiled building materials through connections in New Jersey. And most importantly, he gathered information. Every man Calabrese hired, Bumpy knew their names. Every property Calabrese planned to buy after the fires, Bumpy documented. Every payoff to police and politicians, Bumpy recorded. Every conversation, every handshake, every dollar that changed hands, Bumpy had eyes on all of it. "When you fight a man with power," Bumpy told his lieutenants, "you don't punch him, you take his power away. You show him that everything he thought he controlled was borrowed." The night of July 18th, Bumpy was ready. He watched from the roof of the Hotel Teresa as the fires started. One by one, the buildings lit up. He saw the flames reflect in the windows of the surrounding tenements. He heard the screams, the sirens, the chaos, and he felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Rage, but he didn't move, not yet. He had 72 hours of work ahead of him, and every minute had to be perfect. July 18th, 1965, 3:42 a.m., 125th Street. Bumpy stood in front of those painted words, "G.O. Home," with the fires still burning behind him. The crowd pressed close, waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to tell them what to do. "They want a war, we'll give them ruin." A young man in the crowd shouted, "Then let's go downtown, let's burn their houses the way they burned ours." Bumpy raised a hand. The crowd went silent. "That's what they want," he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the flames. "They want us to riot, they want us to destroy our own neighborhood. They want photographs of black men with torches so they can point at us and say, 'See, animals, they don't deserve what they had.'" He shook his head slowly. "We're not going to give them that. We're going to give them something worse. We're going to rebuild every business, every brick, every window, bigger than before, better than before, and then we're going to destroy the men who did this, not with fire, but with truth." By 6 a.m., Bumpy had mobilized an army. Not of soldiers, but of lawyers, accountants, journalists, and community organizers. The insurance claims were filed before the ashes cooled. Temporary storefronts opened within 48 hours. Construction crews arrived from 3 states, black-owned companies that Bumpy had been supporting for years. But that was only half the plan. The other half was Vincent Calabrese. On July 19th, a package arrived at the offices of the New York Times. Inside were documents proving Calabrese's involvement in the arson, memos, financial records, witness statements. The package was anonymous, but the evidence was undeniable. On July 20th, identical packages arrived at the FBI, the state attorney's office, and the editorial boards of 5 major newspapers. On July 21st, Vincent Calabrese woke up to find his name on the front page of every paper in New York. Developer linked to Harlem arson conspiracy. Mob ties revealed in racist attack. City councilman implicated in burning of black businesses. Within a week, Calabrese was arrested. The 2 councilmen resigned in disgrace. The insurance executives faced federal charges for fraud. The entire conspiracy unraveled like a cheap suit, and every thread led back to men who thought they were untouchable. But Bumpy wasn't finished. He used his connections to ensure that Calabrese's properties, the ones he'd planned to buy with the ashes of Harlem businesses, were seized by the city for unpaid taxes and code violations. Those properties were then sold at auction to a consortium of black investors that Bumpy had quietly assembled months earlier. The land Calabres had tried to steal became the foundation for a new generation of black-owned businesses. The very ground he'd wanted to build his empire on became a monument to his fate. When reporters finally tracked Bumpy down for a comment, he was sitting on a bench in Marcus Garvey Park feeding pigeons. "Mr. Johnson," a reporter asked, "do you have anything to say about Vincent Calabres' arrest?" Bumpy looked up, his face calm. "I don't know any Vincent Calabres, but surely you were involved in—" "Young man," Bumpy interrupted, his voice gentle but firm, "I'm a 60-year-old man who loves his community. That's all I've ever been. If some developer tried to burn down Harlem and got caught, well," he shrugged. "I suppose that's what happens when you underestimate the people you try to destroy." Word of what happened spread through the city like the fires that had started it all. But this time, the story wasn't about destruction. It was about resurrection. By August, every one of the 47 businesses had reopened. Some in temporary locations, others in buildings that rose from the ashes faster than anyone thought possible. The community had rallied in ways that shocked observers, donations pouring in, volunteers working around the clock, a neighborhood refusing to be broken. Vincent Calabres was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He died there in 1971, forgotten and alone. The councilmen never held public office again. The insurance executives lost their licenses and their fortunes. And Harlem stood taller than ever. The attack that was meant to destroy the neighborhood's economic power had the opposite effect. National attention brought investment. The story of how Harlem rebuilt itself became a symbol of black resilience. Young entrepreneurs from across the country moved to the neighborhood, inspired by what they'd seen. Bumpy Johnson never took credit. He never gave interviews about his role. He simply went back to what he'd always done, protecting his community, building power, and playing chess while his enemies were still learning the rules. Bumpy Johnson died 3 years later in 1968 of a heart attack at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue. He was 62 years old. Thousands attended his funeral, business owners, politicians, artists, and ordinary people whose lives he'd touched in ways they could never fully explain. But those who knew the real story of 1965 said that summer was when Bumpy Johnson proved something that history often forgets. The most powerful weapon against hate isn't hate. It's patience. It's preparation. It's the ability to take the worst your enemy can throw at you and turn it into their undoing. Vincent Calabres wanted to destroy Harlem with fire. Bumpy Johnson responded by making Harlem fireproof. And in the end, the only thing that burned was Calabres' empire. "You can't burn down a community," Bumpy told his wife Mame on the night the last business reopened. "You can only burn down buildings. Community lives in the people, and the people are still here." She asked him if he was proud of what he'd done. Bumpy shook his head. "I'm proud of what we did, all of us. I just made sure the right people knew the truth at the right time." He paused, looking out the window at the lights of 125th Street glowing brighter than ever. "That's all power really is when you think about it, knowing the truth and knowing when to use it." If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. We're telling the untold stories of Harlem, stories about power, resilience, and the men who protected their communities when no one else would. Drop a like if you understand why Bumpy let those fires burn before he made his move. Let me know in the comments, could you have waited? Could you have watched your neighborhood burn, knowing that patience was the only path to victory? Next time, we're telling the story of Bumpy Johnson's final confrontation with the NYPD. The night he walked into police headquarters with nothing but a folder and walked out having ended 3 careers. That's a story that's never been told.